The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, and welcome to Infrastructure Journal's online seminar, Can Shale Be a Success Outside the US? My name is Olivia Gagan. I'm a senior reporter for IJ, and I focus principally on energy. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Brian Chase, who will in turn introduce our panelists. And so our moderator, Brian Chase, is of Campbell Lutyens. He is a real asset specialist in the New York office and works closely with a variety of energy and infrastructure managers on their private fund placements. Before joining Campbell, Brian was a principal investor at the Carlyle Group's $1.1 billion infrastructure fund. So I'm very happy to have you here today, Brian. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Olivia, and welcome everybody for joining our webinar. Before we get into the substance, hello?
Brian?
I think we might have just lost Brian briefly. Olivia, do you want to go ahead and introduce the other panelists, and we'll try to get Brian back.
Yeah, sure. So our first panelist, Matthew Townsend, is head of the London Environmental and Climate Change Group at Allen and Overy. Matt is a regulatory specialist. He advises on environmental, health and safety and climate change matters across a broad range of corporate and real estate transactions and projects. His particular focus is on energy, and he advises a number of international oil companies and developers. His specialisms include regulatory matters, the development of environmentally sensitive projects, and the management of environmental risk. So welcome, Matt. We also have Greg Pytel, who is a European Commission advisor and energy expert at the, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Sobieski Institute.
That's right.
Greg is a risk professional and an international business development consultant. He specializes in risk analysis of the early phase of new ventures, so ideally suited to talking about shale. He's worked on a number of international and local strategic initiatives that led to new partnerships and cooperation frameworks in oil and gas. So that's Greg. We also have on the line David Koranyi, who is Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council, oh, again a funny pronunciation, Patriciu Eurasia Centre.
Yep.
Koranyi is a non-resident fellow also at the Johns Hopkins University SAIS Centre for Transatlantic Relations. He has previously served as Undersecretary of State and Chief Foreign Policy and National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of the Republic of Hungary. So those are three of our panelists. At the moment, we appear to not have our moderator, Brian Chase, on the line.
Actually, Olivia, I'm back on.
Oh, he's back. Fantastic. Right. Brian, sorry about
Great.
that. We appear to have a problem with the line. But I've introduced our panelists, so if you want to take it away, then feel free.
Very good. Maybe if we could move to that first slide, please, about will the Shale Gale blow outside of the U.S.
Yeah.
And just to give the conventional wisdom among the infrastructure investors that I speak with is that their views on shale gas, at least up until about 6 months ago, were that it's good for the U.S. economy, but it's largely irrelevant in Europe. And that's because of the higher population density in Europe, the fact that Europeans care more about their environment than Americans do apparently, and that the shale geology itself is different in the fact that the shale deposits tend to be deeper in Europe than they do in some of the U.S. basins. I would argue, however, that the main issue that's really more relevant is its absence of private mineral rights, and also the equipment and pipeline infrastructure services companies just in the U.S. Whatever the reason, and maybe it's a combination of both of those factors, what I've also found is that some of the more sophisticated investors that we speak with are looking at the question differently now. They're looking at some of the direct impacts of shale gas, and then they're also looking at some of the indirect impacts. So what I mean by the direct impacts is, shale gas exploration and production in Europe is likely to be quite limited, at least in the next several years, as an investment opportunity. Although the longer-term prospects do look good for it. But the indirect impacts are already happening. If you look at what the gas costs are in Europe versus the U.S., they tend to be about 3 to 5 times higher. And so that's creating investment opportunities for different types of infrastructure assets, such as LNG import facilities, pipelines, and some of the equipment and service companies, most of which tend to be based either in Stavanger, Norway, Aberdeen, Scotland, or Houston, Texas. So with that little introduction, if we could go to the next slide, please, Olivia, that talks about the U.S. versus Europe. And Matt, if you wouldn't mind just updating us on what some of the shale gas regulatory environmental changes are in the UK and at the European Commission level, and then maybe Greg can comment on Poland and some of the other trends he's seeing. Matt?
Sure, thanks, Brian. I think on the slide, we posed the question as to whether the regulatory environment is right in Europe for shale to flourish. I think my view on that is, at the moment, no. What we have in Europe is each individual member state will have its own regulatory architecture for shale, as well as other oil and gas developments. And there's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of years as to the need for a kind of single overarching regulatory regime across Europe in order to smooth out some of the wrinkles that we see on a country-by-country basis. And I'll come back to that as to whether I think that's a good idea or not. Just looking at this from a kind of UK perspective, there's been a number of political announcements over the last 6 months, one just before Christmas by the government, where a number of initiatives were announced. One in particular was the creation of, or proposed creation of the Office for Unconventional Gas and Oil, which is meant to be something of a kind of oversea department to make permitting and getting the necessary consents a kind of smoother and less cumbersome process. So that is certainly a step in the right direction. And then more recently, you've had announcements from the Chancellor in the March budget for various tax incentives for the shale gas industry. The details of those really still to be kind of fleshed out, but again, that's seen as an encouraging sign. Plus, on the more kind of technical side, you've got proposals to review the planning guidance for shale, which again, that is one of the major hurdles to getting shale projects up and running on a widespread basis. So again, I think all of those political pronouncements are, are positive. The question is, how far is it going to affect things in the short term? And I think it kind of begs the question really for us as to whether the regulatory framework both in the UK and in Europe is really fit for purpose for this. And one of the problems that I think we face, and regulators face as well as investors, is that you've got multiple regulatory regimes governing different aspects of a typical shale gas project. So you've got multiple permit requirements, whether it's mining waste permits, it's radioactive substance permits, it's CO2, greenhouse gas emission permits, and the like, plus the major, what we in the UK would call the PEDL, the Petroleum Exploration and Development Licence, which is the major consent. Together with a number of other consent requirements, including planning. And so what that creates is a fairly cumbersome process for developers to get the necessary consents. It's costly. At the moment, it's not particularly joined up, despite the best efforts of government and local regulators. And so I think there's a lot of inefficiencies in the system at the moment. Which, I mean, in one sense is potentially understandable. This is, for Europe at least, is something of an evolving technology, and so this will take time. And just coming back to the kind of European dimension of this, as I mentioned, the Commission has been looking closely at, first of all, whether there are any major gaps in the regulatory regime that need to be plugged, and secondly, is there a need for a single overarching regime? And I think clearly, my view on this is clearly in the medium to long term, having consistent regulation in each member state on this and consistent permitting and clarity around what is and is not needed, I think would be a very positive step. In the short term, however, there is a real danger that it will move in this direction, will create yet more uncertainty as to the permitting and some of the kind of investment risks. So I think that's really how I see it. And the Commission, back in January of last year, published a study on the kind of licensing procedures for shale, and they basically concluded that there were no significant gaps in the kind of regulatory coverage. Not to say that the system couldn't be improved and made more efficient, but there weren't any kind of major gaps. One thing importantly, in my view, that was highlighted was this the issue of public participation and the need to enhance public participation and decision making in the process, which some people may regard as a very positive thing, others may see as a potential hindrance or delay factor for the rollout. So in Europe, at least, the kind of question about what we do with the regulatory framework and whether further studies are required is still very much kind of open question. I think it's fair to say. Just a couple of other very quick points, and then I'll let others comment. The first one is there is an extent here of the regulators kind of learning by doing, and that's not a criticism, because they are having to look at this from a UK and European perspective for the first time, but they are unfamiliar with how to kind of fit the various regulatory strands together, and what that results in is a greater conservatism to take decisions, because they know that the NGOs and pressure groups are looking very closely at the granting of consents on these projects. So I think that, in my view, has slowed things down, and the kind of shadow of potential legal challenge and judicial review in the UK hangs very heavily over the process. And then finally, and Brian, you touched on this, the role of NGOs in this process is important, and it should not be underestimated. These are very well resourced, now well-organised groups. They have a lot of legal support, both in-house as well as on a pro bono basis, and they are very active in Europe and in a number of countries very powerful. So they are an element in this debate that should not be ignored.
Thanks very much, Matt. And Greg, many investors had predicted that Poland would lead the shale gas exploration and production. But when we last spoke, you were much more bullish on the UK. What do you think are some of the lessons to be learned from the Polish experience as they apply to the rest of Europe and the UK?
Well, thank you very much, Brian, and thank you very much, Matt, for that introduction. I would like to pick up on the point made by Matt in his excellent comments, that when he mentioned that we are basically learning by doing, and what I would conclude that in that sense we possibly end up reinventing the wheel, or some even more primitive device that was invented some many years ago. In Polish experience, and I don't want to narrow it too much on it, because it's quite representative to what's really happening and what would be happening in continental onshore European Union and Europe in general. The more you go to the east, I guess the more acute the problems would become, for a couple of reasons. One reason is political reason of long-term dependency on gas supplies from Russia, and the other one is that the economy over there is more, at least in strategic sectors like oil and gas and energy in general, is more dependent on state involvement and state direct interventions and ownership in it. So to get that first point across, I think it may well help to point out on the differences, or on a question why US was ready for shale gas revolution, which relates to the question originally Brian asked, whether US revolution can be replicated in Europe? I mean, my first answer is no, it cannot be replicated. However, whether shale gas could be made success in Europe, yes, it can, but there are many lessons we can learn from the US situation. I mean, to start with, and this is showing on the US example and going back to the Poland's example, where things basically stalled, was that US, when shale gas revolution started, or when shale gas heavy development started some 4 or 5 years ago, but that's been going on for like 20 years. The service sector, which we mean by contractors doing drilling, fracking, and all the other things, seismic and other services, logistics, and so on, well, actually, it was actually always a very competitive sector based on the private ownership and quite large market. Then, because US was actually in a decline of production of oil and gas onshore for so many years before shale gas picked up, then this sector adjusted its prices, so it was really competitive on the price, and they were accustomed to low cost of onshore, low rates for onshore drilling. Whereas in Europe, the business onshore is simply, well, very little, if one could even claim non-existent. And in terms of competition, it's not really there. I mean, we talk something like 80 or maybe up to 100 land drilling rigs in Europe, whereas we talk well over 1,000, something like 1,800 drilling rigs in the US. So this gives a comparison. Then the other aspect is, which Brian mentioned as well, and I just only flag it again, is a private ownership of licenses. And this is a huge issue. The issue is that in the US, wherever people go, wherever companies go and want to drill or want to explore, they practically do a private negotiations in terms of royalties and beneficiary for mineral rights, who is a private owner. And if that private owner, what it appears, doesn't do too good a deal, then, you know, tough, it's really a matter for the private owner. Whereas in Europe, this thing is incredibly politically sensitive for any political party or the government. Hence, simply, the government always want to, governments always want to have the upside of a situation, so they cannot be later on accused of simply giving away natural resources or natural wealth. Or national wealth of the countries. And the other aspect related to private ownership is that because, and public in Europe or in Poland, is that whilst in the US, because it's a private ownership and people want to benefit from the mineral rights, you've got more of an attitude, please do it in my backyard. Why? Because, you know, it's a source of my income. Whereas in Europe, where it's centrally state-controlled, we've got that situation which comes to the point of, no, not in my backyard, please. And then, of course, these things transpire, you know, in democratic countries, in legislations related to environmental protections and all the procedures and permitting things that run across the board. So what we can generally call by fiscal regulations. Then the other aspect is actually fiscal incentives. And it's not mentioned that much that since I think 1980 or 1981, US had a quite sophisticated system of tax credits for unconventional hydrocarbons production. Originally, it wasn't focused at all on shale gas, because shale gas business started something like in the 1990s or at that time, whereas it was more directed towards things like tight gas or tight hydrocarbons and then CBM. However, as the system was generally, how to say, directed towards unconventional production, it didn't favor anybody. Then, you know, the market really picked up the winner, and the winner is shale gas that nobody predicted at the start of that system. To wrap up that point, I would say that, well, why UK? Not many people know that actually UK is already a producer of not shale gas, but unconventional gas in form of a tight gas. For example, in the southern North Sea, there is a field called Babbage, which is actually, surprise, surprise, run by E.ON, operated by E.ON, where they're really fracking like hell and producing quite a lot of gas thanks to fracking technology and, well, directional drilling. So not many people know that, and not many people realize that actually unconventional gas production is already here in the UK. And if Europe can learn any lesson from history, it wouldn't really be looking maybe back underlying legal things are different. I mean, things like, as I mentioned, private ownership of mineral resources. But a lot of lessons should be learned from the way North Sea was developed in the UK and in Norway, and actually it was developed between the UK and Norway in quite close cooperation between centres in Aberdeen and Stavanger, and the legislation was put in place. The area was risky, but was made competitive, or was drafted to be competitive. So in that sense, it is possible. Now, maybe I summarize my sort of point, talking about also the other perspective on US and Europe, and especially including Poland, which I would like to comment that because it was quite a test case, for shale gas in Europe, that relates to overall economic productivity. If we look at the research data, and I can provide some more information if any participants would like to, there was a lot of research done about the productivity levels in the industry across the world. And the US is on the top of that productivity league, whereas countries in Europe and in Poland are much lower down the scale. Not very low, but still lower down the scale. So when we talk about the industries, such as long-term investment in industries, in exploration, in natural resources, and also investment in infrastructure, the productivity matters when we look at prospective returns, and how can we rely on this sort of, how to say, predicted returns. So US, by definition, due to higher productivity level, has a far better, is a far better place to invest. Then there is a twist in that actually structure, that in the US, which is overall more productive than Europe, and especially countries towards Central Eastern Europe, the industry is mainly privately owned and privately managed. Whereas in Central Eastern Europe, these industries, oil and gas, are mainly driven by state-controlled industries. And then at that point, surprise, surprise, in the overall sort of league of, by type of ownership, private enterprises, especially multinationals, are far more productive in that league than state-owned enterprises. So in that sense, the US, when it came to shale gas revolution, had the best of both worlds. Basically, it's more productive in general, and the industry is in a more productive sector, which is a private sector, whereas Europe is less productive in general, and the oil and gas industry, especially towards Central Eastern Europe, is controlled by a less productive sector of the economy, which is a state-controlled sector. So on that point, I think there is this sort of a pretty large gap to be bridged somehow in the way we look at it, and it doesn't only relate to things like regulations and legal aspects, which are of course very important, but also to the structure of the industry and the lessons we can actually learn from our own backyard, which I would say is UK and Norway. And for that reason alone, I would say that there are some risks and uncertainties related, for example, to environmental movements and to local protesters related to onshore developments. But I think for these reasons, UK is possibly best positioned in Europe to, how to say, to capitalize on the existence of unconventional resources, which, as I mentioned, are already produced in the southern North Sea offshore. It's a tight gas, not shale gas, not to be confused. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Greg and Matt. And just the takeaway I've had from this previous discussion is that material impediments exist right now in Europe to onshore unconventional oil and gas production, at least in the near term. But I think, as our next speaker, David, will tell us, that's not to say that Europe is now insulated from the effects of the U.S. shale gas production. And before I turn to David, just to look at the chart, next chart, is shale already helping Europe increase its energy security? You can see from this recent chart, what a wide variety of different prices exist for LNG imports and exports at various areas of the world. In addition to that, the U.S. has already surpassed Russia as the world's leading producer of natural gas and is expected to surpass Saudi Arabia within the next few years in terms of oil output. So, there clearly are geopolitical implications for Europe. One, for example, is Russia's oil index gas pricing going to come under further pressure What about China? And I think David, who is a specialist in energy geopolitics, is a great person to walk us through this next part of discussion. David?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I mean, you said the most important things. The bottom line is that even if no single cubic meter of shale gas is going to come online in the future in Europe in the next 10 years, let's say, there are already repercussions of the shale gas revolution in the United States and repercussions and implications to European gas markets. Namely that what we have seen and what we have witnessed in the last couple of years is that as the U.S. was even 6-7 years ago was preparing to become the largest natural gas importer in the world, they built up a lot of LNG regasification terminals on the coasts of the U.S. So they were preparing to import gas from places like Qatar and Trinidad and Tobago and Nigeria. But then the shale gas revolution kicked in, and the U.S. found itself in a situation where they cover already more than 25% of their natural gas supplies from shale, and this is going to increase to close to 50% by the mid of next decade. And as you said, Brian, the U.S. has already become, back in 2010, the biggest natural gas producer, surpassing Russia. So all that caused to have all those shipments originally destined for the U.S. market from Qatar, Nigeria, etc., LNG shipments, liquefied natural gas shipments, to end up in Europe in the last couple of years. And that had the effect of bringing down prices in Europe as well. It's the indirect effect of the shale gas revolution in the U.S. And that is especially true in the western part of the continent, which is much better supplied with LNG regasification terminals already. The UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Spain, and Italy. Whereas LNG terminals are not there yet in Eastern Europe. But what you have seen in the last couple of years is that because of all these extra liquidity in the form of LNG coming to the European market, spot prices were going down, and utilities in Germany, in Italy, in France were in a position to renegotiate their contracts with Russia, their traditional suppliers. Contracts which are usually based on oil indexation, resulting in higher prices. But because of that extra liquidity on the European markets, they were able to renegotiate these contracts and increase the share of spot pricing within these contracts and bringing down the prices for Europeans. And there is another angle which is going to be very important in the next couple of months to look at closely, and then will unfold during the course of the next couple of years, especially after 2015, is the question of U.S. LNG exports. Since the U.S. is still increasing production, there is a big debate going on, a big domestic political debate going on in the U.S. right now, whether to allow for exporting natural gas in the form of LNG, and whether this will happen, and to what extent this will happen, and where exactly these LNG shipments will go if they are allowed to leave U.S. shores, will also have serious repercussions on European energy security and European prices, and have in the medium and long term the potential to actually break the oil indexation in Europe, and also to some extent in Asia as well, again resulting in bringing down prices.
Thanks, David. I think that's certainly one of the most important points about the breaking of oil indexation of gas contracts in Europe. But there's some other very significant indirect impacts of increased U.S. shale gas production for Europe. One of which is environmental consequences for Germany associated with increased coal production or gas-fired, power generation from coal. Yeah. And then also just higher energy prices for the German manufacturing industry related to subsidies for renewables. Can you talk about some of those other trends that are impacting Europe and are likely to do so in the next few years?
Yeah, that's right. On the coal thing, I mean, to be honest, I think it got a lot of traction lately in the news that how ironic it is that Europe, which is at the forefront of the battle of against climate change, is increasing its electricity generation from coal, and especially Germany, which is like one of the greenest member states in the European Union, is increasing coal and underutilizing gas. My take on this is that this is a temporary phenomenon. There are several reasons for that. One is that there is legislation already in place in the European Union, which will take some time to kick in, but eventually will have the results by the mid of this decade to gradually phase out coal-generated electricity. Rules regarding power plants and coal-fired power plants will have the effect in the next couple of years to increase the cost of coal production. And the recent surge in coal production is the result of that particular directive on the European level, which is structured in a way that it essentially allows for burning coal for a limited period of time in the next couple of years, and then it will be phased out, or it will substantially increase the cost and also the regulatory requirements for coal-fired power plants in the European Union, which eventually will make it more or less prohibitively expensive to build new coal-fired power plants. So I think it's a temporary phenomenon, the increase of coal. That also pertains to actually the U.S. because of cheap gas in the U.S., coal was shipped from the U.S. to Europe because the cheap gas was replacing coal quite fast in the last couple of years in the U.S. in electricity generation, which reduced the need and the demand for coal in the U.S., so most of that coal were actually shipped to Europe. And the third factor of that is and I expect that to happen also by the end of this year or maybe early next year, is the revamping of the so-called European emission trading system, which was set up in a way that resulted in much lower carbon prices than its designers originally expected, and which now have the effect that coal is actually still competitive even though you have to pay the carbon price. And gas is because of the still higher prices than the U.S., and then because of the low carbon prices, because you know gas emits around half of what coal emits when you burn it to produce electricity. But if you make the corrections in the emission trading scheme, the European emission trading scheme, which is going to be done probably during the course of the next 12 months, then this will amount to putting gas into a much more competitive position again on the European market. So what I expect is that this dip in gas usage, also due to the economic crisis, will resurge in the next couple of years. Again, irrespective of whether shale gas is going to happen or not.
That's great. Thank you, David. And I wanted to give both Matt and Greg a chance to comment. Matt, you want to go first, please?
Sure, yes. Thank you for that. I mean, I think the key thing for me, and the big differentiator with the US is what we've got is essentially some conflicting demands, kind of competing demands that I don't think have really been properly resolved. And this is at a fairly high level. You've got governments where they are driven by an agenda, as you would expect, for kind of energy supply and energy security, but they are also driven quite understandably from a kind of revenue perspective for revenues from the mineral rights. You've got developers, investors, and in the normal course, and then you've got societal groups and NGOs which have their own agenda, and as has been touched upon, in Europe, I think it's a slightly different game than it is in the US. And how you resolve what at times may be three slightly competing agendas and demands there, I think in Europe that's really still to settle down. I mean, in many senses, it's not unlike any other emerging technology as such, and you will always have those slightly competing and conflicting demands. I mean, I think it struck me when I was thinking about this that if you were suddenly tomorrow to come up with nuclear as a technology and say, actually, we want to build our first full-scale nuclear plant in Europe, I think there's a very strong argument that it would never get off the ground because of concerns, environmental, regulatory, and other concerns. And so I think we've got to see shale in that perspective. I think the point is very well made about the context of the drive for low or no carbon power generation in Europe. That I think is a very, very important issue. And as we all know, one of the environmental consequences from shale gas is kind of methane and greenhouse gas emissions and how you capture those, fugitive emissions, what you do with them, etc. And there's both a pricing aspect to this, which has been touched upon, and the incentives and the disincentives that the EU ETS creates. There's also a very kind of practical aspect to it as well, as to how do you capture those emissions and what do you do with them, and could, for instance, shale be caught within the ETS and be subject to the the downward pressures that other sectors are subject to. So it very much needs to be looked at there. The UK, in that context, the UK has made a significant commitment in terms of targets to see an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050 rather, and Europe has made similar well-publicised commitments, and they're significant. I mean, the UK figure is a significant figure, and that very much dictates government policy in the energy space. And so you've got to see the rollout of shale, I think, in that context.
Very good. Thanks, Matt. Maybe, Greg, in the interest of time, turning to the next slide about the environmental risks that are unique to Europe that are associated with the unconventional gas production. We've talked a lot already about what the so-called above-ground risks are related to the regulatory and political environment. As I mentioned in the beginning, there are different below-ground risks for Europe versus the U.S. because of the deeper shale deposits and the higher population densities. Can you talk just about some of the particular environmental issues for Europe?
Well, in Europe, I would say the first issue would, in terms of environmental risk, would relate to social perception, because government in Europe and regulators are experienced enough already to manage, seemingly any kind of risk. The point is whether they can, strike a balance in terms of expected return for the investors, and in terms of protection for the public, and also in terms of perception by the public of the right protection. What's happening in Europe, and I can speak that from various discussions I had with the industry, is that, in my view, industry in Europe cornered itself into the point of talking about it as it was completely kind of a risk-free situation. Because wherever we see these environmental aspects and arguments of basically companies coming and trying to explore in certain areas, at that point, typically companies start giving assurances that it is safe. However, this safe under the pressure has got an underlying message that it's supposed to be 100% safe. No geologist or reservoir engineer would give any assurance that anything in the world is 100% safe. However, the point is that it is highly unlikely that there would be any accident. So this is the first point I'm putting across, that industry talked itself a little bit into unwinnable situation, being forced to start giving 100% assurances where they simply don't exist. The other point is that the aspect which actually environmentally relate to this aspect of mineral rights ownership, what's in it for us? Because when mineral rights belong to the state, the direct beneficiary is not immediately people who basically have by law give access to their land. And if the industry and the state and the regulators first don't address the safety, environmental safety issues, but they also don't address the issue for local communities, what's in it for us, basically how we are going to benefit from the developments, then typically environmental arguments start coming across as the major concerns, although these are not really, I would say, genuine arguments. What do I mean by not genuine arguments? If you look, for example, at Poland, you've got two regions in the south, one which is Upper Silesia, which is based on coal, and the other side is, and west to Upper Silesia is Lower Silesia, which is now based, it's one of the major regions in the world producing copper. And there were always environmental concerns when these industries were developed. Coal industry has been developing for the last 200 or even more years in Upper Silesia. Last 50 years is in Lower Silesia and copper ore mining. The issue is that all that local communities, despite all the environmental concerns and all the environmental accidents that happen there, they are actually direct beneficiaries from the developments. So at that stage, I would put that we cannot talk about environmental concerns disassociated from the benefits for the society which lives in the areas of development. So in the situations like in Upper Silesia, where industry developed organically and people rely on jobs and benefits coming out of financial benefits coming out of these developments, or in the Lower Silesia, where the same thing happened, with copper mining, and people accepted it, then whilst environmental issues are being dealt with and they are managed, the industry is highly accepted. And well, even if we see, or experience earthquakes in southern Poland, small earthquakes due to subsidence or in that area, in areas of mining, try to talk about closing down the mines, and you immediately get miners and local people on strike. So to summarize this point, yes, the professional environmental concerns are there, but fracking technology, it's very old. Actually, it's nearly 200 years old. I think it was in the beginning of the 19th century there was a first unconventional production, and the real fracking was started by Halliburton some, I think 60 years ago. So this is not a new technology, and the risks can be managed. However, in order to get across the message for local population that it's nothing, how to say, there's something to be managed, but nothing to be overly concerned more than anything that we do in life. People have to become beneficiary of these developments. And this could be what we can see for the industry, a guiding point, that at present Europe is a little bit in the dire straits of its economic, in its economic situation. So, and as we know, all these industries, natural resources industries, provide a lot of local jobs and jobs across the whole spectrum, from the most menial ones to the most sophisticated ones. So from that perspective, one could say that if the decision makers and the politicians and leaders will see an opportunity to grab for economic growth in it, then going back to the point of environmental concerns, yeah, on technical level and on, I'm pretty sure, legal and regulatory level, they can be overcome, provided they will that such approach will win a popular support.
Thank you, Greg. I think that's an important point about the link between local economic benefits and linking them with the results of shale gas production in order to overcome some of the environmental opposition based on jobs and improving the local economy. I want to get into the next slide, which is what are the costs and who would invest, and really focus on the business development opportunities within Europe that are associated with shale gas, either directly or indirectly. And David, you made some very interesting points about the fact that certain LNG import facilities, and I would assume some of the associated midstream pipeline networks, are likely to become more or less valuable if and when significant LNG imports begin. David, could you comment a little more on that, and then I'd like to get Matt and Greg in with a couple of quick questions, quick comments afterwards before we get to questions.
Sure.
David?
Before I do that, just to reinforce Greg's point on the importance of politics in this whole thing, and that is especially true in the eastern part of the continent, is that, I mean, recently energy prices brought down a government in Bulgaria. Typically energy prices are pretty high in Central and Eastern Europe, and especially high when you compare it proportionally to the incomes in that region. So it's also a social issue, in addition to being a political issue and the dependence on Russia issue. So it's something which the politicians are slowly, I think, grasping that there is something in it for them as well, and for the populations, and it's economic competitiveness, but it's also social stability. And shale gas could be a long-term, not a solution, but part of the solution to try to bring down energy prices, very often very closely connected to natural gas prices in that region. So that's very important. And just another remark on a previous conversation on costs. There was a report by the International Energy Agency, costs related to the environmental factors. And the bottom line of the report, it was called the Golden Age, the Golden Rules for a Golden Age of Gas. And the bottom line of the report was that on average, and of course it depends on a lot of different factors, but on average, if you want to comply with all the best practices and environmental legislation and do the well casing properly and capture emissions and flaring and all the right things which protects the environment and do it in the best possible way, that increases the average costs more or less by 7%, which is well within the range of bearable costs. So that could not be, and the technical solutions exist, as Greg also emphasized. They have been around for decades now, and also the cost factor can be overcome. So that said, back to your question in terms of infrastructure and investment opportunities, I see those particularly in LNG and also in midstream and pipeline investment opportunities. LNG, the eastern part of the continent is not particularly well supplied. There is an ongoing construction of an LNG terminal only in Poland, which, as far as I know, will be finished by the end of next year, by 2014, in Świnoujście. But apart from that, there are ongoing discussions about an LNG terminal in the Baltics, and there is an LNG terminal planned for a long time in Croatia, but was not proceeding. So these could be investment opportunities. These are ranging for a couple of $1 billion. Also, LNG terminals in Turkey. That is also something which is being discussed, and also Ukraine. Although I'm somewhat more skeptical about an LNG import terminal in Ukraine, mostly due to the fact that the Turks are not particularly enthusiastic about allowing LNG tankers through the Bosporus, which is already kind of full, and the traffic there is so heavy that it's going to be tricky to increase. But the LNG terminals in the eastern part of the continent is one. And the other is the midstream, but I think Greg and Matt are in a better position to talk about that, so I would leave it for them.
Greg?
Well, in terms of midstream, the problem Europe faces is the lack of north-south infrastructure in the eastern side of Europe at present. Whereas if we look at the Western Europe, simply from Germany to the west, the infrastructure is sort of flexible and big enough to handle any kind of logistics in terms of the gas transportation to satisfy the demand. In terms of when we look towards Eastern Europe, the infrastructure built was designed mainly to supply the gas from Russia to the neighboring countries or countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc. So we see a lot of pipelines, high-capacity pipelines going from Russia to the west, through Poland, through, well, Nord Stream, starting with Nord Stream, but then through Poland, Slovakia, and Czech Republic, and then also the pipeline down going to Romania and Bulgaria. So in this sense, Europe lacks that that element. Now, currently there are built some interconnectors in Central Eastern Europe, where we talk about Poland being connected with the Czech Republic and then further down. The problem with these interconnectors is that they are not of the strategic nature. I think currently Poland is connected to something like 500 million cubic meters of gas a year, and I think to be increased to 2.5 billion. And even if the talk is about 3-4 billion, this is still not such a capacity. If we look, that could provide north-south trunk line for gas delivery. So this is what technically, or should give an opportunity to invest and to build it. However, we are ending up in a bit of a chicken and egg situation from investment point of view. Because if such an infrastructure was already in place, the investment in exploration and production of natural gas in Central Europe would be more viable because there would be already infrastructure there. However, because it is not, it makes it less actually viable. On the other side, if investment was already made and commitment made to produce gas, well, supported by discoveries, then investors into infrastructure could secure the use and the use of the capacity of the planned infrastructure. So this is a kind of a chicken and egg situation of two sides of the same coin, which is production and logistics. Both are long-term and big investments. So this is point one. Point two on that is also the pipeline politics, which is still going on in that region. And as we see, Nord Stream already built, which simply completely bypass Central Eastern Europe with gas delivery from Russia to Germany, supposedly to be with capacity increase up to 120 billion cubic meters a year. Currently, I think it's around 60, half of that's two legs of that pipeline. And then there's already a similar large pipeline, South Stream, being planned to be built from Russia as well on the southern side of Europe. Then, in the backdrop of that, we've got a Nabucco project, which I think had already lasted a decade. Nothing was built. The price in that period increased twofold, from something like 7 billion euros to 14 billion euros in terms of the project cost, and it's not there. So any investor has to look seriously not only into an underlying rationale of a situation, capacity, markets, potential production, and so on, but also a huge element of politics, who's got interest in making it happen or actually preventing that from being happen. And in this case, due to the dominance of Russia as a supplier in the region, I think there are strong commercial and political interest in frustrating such developments.
Thanks, Greg. So if I can summarize from what David and Greg have both just said, is there now exist interesting investment opportunities involving infrastructure assets that are impacted by shale gas in Europe. Matt, I wanted to give you the sort of the final word, and then Olivia maybe get to a couple of questions. So Matt, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. One thing that strikes me actually is I saw some stats recently about the level of M&A activity in connection with the shale gas industry in the US, and the stats were, I don't have them in front of me, but they were very surprising. I mean, it's generating a large amount of M&A activity, not just through direct kind of investment opportunities, but the kind of spin-off suppliers and industries and contractors that are making a play in the sector. So I think that's another kind of important dimension of it. And I mean, I'd agree with what we've heard. You know, there clearly are investment opportunities. We've seen relatively recently, you know, Shell's potential investments in the Ukraine, and I saw Ukrainian politicians being quoted as saying that there's going to be something like $10 billion worth of investment in this sector. I don't know whether Shell would agree with that or not, but it gives you a kind of indication of some of the figures that some people are thinking about. But from where I sit, this to me is in Europe at least, is a game of evolution and not revolution. You know, we've talked about some of the uncertainties and challenges that the sector faces, and they are going to take time to kind of work through. So you could be easily looking at a further 5 years for greater exploration, another 2 to 5 years for development, and then however many years for full production. So I think clearly investors will need to be patient. Just to pick up on one point, and I think it was Greg that was talking about this. This is one of the differences with the US, which is potentially quite controversial from a policy perspective. But of course, in Europe, from an environmental angle, we have this this concept of the precautionary principle, and so and the basic premise is that unless you have concrete evidence that something is safe and will not harm the environment, you should not proceed with it, and you should wait until you've got hard evidence that it is safe to develop. Now, for many people, they see that as a very positive environmental goal and step, and a very important part of policy making. For others, it can be seen as a hindrance to legitimate and perfectly safe development, and so I think that kind of debate rolls on. So I think, I think clearly there are investment opportunities. I think there's a lot of work to be done politically to make that happen. Europe clearly, demographically, geologically, a very different place to the US. So the kind of repercussions of some of the developments and the environmental effects are perhaps seen in a more concentrated manner, and that does colour people's thinking about it.
Thanks, Matt. Olivia, maybe we can get to at least a couple of questions quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So very briefly, and I'm aware this is a very broad question, but one question we received from a listener was, how do you see the potential for shale in China? I don't know if one of you feels like you have some insight on that.
David, maybe you can take that, because I know you're following the issue. So briefly, please.
The Chinese, according to the American Energy Information Administration, the Chinese have even more shale gas reserves than the U.S. has. Again, the question is, what will be the cost of that, and can they get this out of the ground? There are several problems around Chinese shale, like water issues, which is one of the main obstacles of getting shale out of the ground right now in China. In Sichuan province, which is one of the most shale-rich provinces in China, it's the home of the Chinese water table. So kind of environmental concerns exist there that shale gas developments could endanger the water table there. And then the other province, which is very shale-rich, which is a remote province called Tianjin, is very arid. So and because at this point, at least until technology further develops, you need a large quantities of water in order to do fracking. That's also a problem, that there is no water there. So that said, there is a range of multinationals and also the Chinese national oil and gas companies heavily investing in shale gas exploration at this point. Just the other day, I think 2 days ago, Shell announced that they will spend $1 billion in the next couple of years annually to explore China's unconventional gas reserves, and they are pretty upbeat about that. The official target for China to produce from shale gas is 100 BCM, billion cubic meters per year, by the end of this decade, which I honestly find a bit too ambitious, and the timeline is very ambitious. But I'm also quite confident that eventually some of these shale resources will come online, that the Chinese are under heavy pressure to reduce electricity generation from coal. They have the ever-increasing demand for energy, and it's not primarily because of climate change angle, but primarily because of air quality issues. And it is becoming a political issue in large Chinese cities. You can hardly breathe, and that's primarily because of the coal-generated electricity. So there is a political resolve to replace coal by gas. similar to what has happened in the U.S. At an increased pace in the next couple of years, and that's what the main driver is in China. So, and I mean, just to put the numbers, right now Chinese are consuming somewhere around 150 BCM per year, and this consumption, according to the International Energy Agency, will go up to close to 600 BCM by 2035. So there is a huge potential demand there, and part of it, I'm pretty sure, will be satisfied from Chinese domestic shale gas. And then, I mean, not just China, but there are other places around the world like Argentina, South Africa, Mexico with huge shale reserves, and then there are other places, including actually Russia. We don't know much about how much shale or unconventional gas reserves they have, although they have huge amounts of conventional reserves still, but they might have additional unconventional reserves. So this, again, as Greg and Matt also said, this is at the very early stage everywhere outside the United States. So it's going to take at least 5-6 more years in Europe and in China as well to have a better understanding of what's there, what will be the costs, and how much you will be able to get out of ground.
That's great. Thanks, David. And Olivia, I'm guessing you're going to tell us we're out of time for any more questions. So thank you to the panelists and for Infrastructure Journal for organizing this discussion, and I look forward to future discussions on this topic.
Great. Thank you, Brian, for moderating. Also, a big thank you to David, Greg, and Matthew for being our panelists today. We've had a few questions come through from listeners. We'll try and get back to you after the webinar has ended. But for now, that is the end of our shale gas webinar. Thank you to everyone for listening in, and do check out our future webinars as well.